rapidly warming world could cause serious problems for civilization in the decades to come. Climate change and warmer temperatures are changing weather patterns and disrupting the usual balance of nature. From hurricanes and flooding to droughts and forest fires, these changes pose many risks to all life forms on Earth. One potential means of returning temperature to pre-industrial levels would be the outer space parasol. So Shamima, what is the outer space parasol and how does it work?
Optical design for a very thin refractive screen with a low reflectivity, leading to a total sunshade mass of about 20 million tons. And if predictions are correct, we would need to divert just 2 to 4% of sunlight, and it would take Earth back to its pre-industrial climate. So what are some possible problems? Because this seems like a really great idea, right? And how would they be solved? One problem is that the weight needed to stop the sunshades from being blown away by the pressure would get very costly, and for even very cheap or light materials, especially to send them up into space. So tethering the shade to a counterbalance is one solution. But that's very hard to do because spacecrafts can only take about 50 tons up to low orbit, and in order to be a counterbalance, there needs to be 3.5 million tons. So it poses a challenge on how materials will get up to space. It is not a permanent solution, but it does help us take a step in the right direction. We have some animations here to show you how the outer space parasol works. Okay, so Kiyomi, could you tell us some more about the science behind all of this?
Of course, a sunshade would not eliminate the need to stop burning coal, oil, and gas. It's just like you would turn a knob down on the sun, Dr. Angel said, and you don't mess with the atmosphere. So even if we remove pollution, the planet will keep warming because we still have greenhouse gases, and that's what the sun shield would try to prevent. In terms of the environmental impacts, it's hard to predict exactly what will happen because the atmosphere is a very complicated system. But in one simulation that scientists did, if we lower the Earth's temperature back to pre-industrial times, the temperatures based on latitudes will not go back to pre-industrial times. So the tropics will still be too cool and the Arctic areas will still be too warm. It's just that the global temperature will go back to what it used to be.
The giant parasol has had many critics of the intervention. I have Suzanne Barr right here, who is going to express her negative feelings of this intervention.
A sunshade would be astronomically expensive and could not be implemented in time, given the speed of global warming. In addition, a solar storm or collision with stray space rocks could damage the shield, resulting in sudden, rapid warming with disastrous consequences.
From the data, we believe that Americans and the populace as a whole will be skeptical of this solution. 54% of Americans, based on Pew Research, believe that climate change is a problem or threat, which means that 46% of Americans do not believe that climate change is a threat to our society and world as a whole. So this poses a threat to how people will respond and if they will give their support to this cause. There's been large questioning on who is able to decide when and how to do this large-scale project, and who has the authority to decide. There are many issues with how everyone will agree on the ethics of this large-scale project, as this will interfere with Earth's climate system. There are many issues with how everyone will agree on the ethics of this large-scale project, as this will interfere with Earth's climate system, and who will take responsibility for the failures that could potentially happen. With space, there's always a question of failure. There could be possible issues in the public acceptance of the giant parasol, with many would see this as a band-aid solution, one where we are not mitigating the real issues, but trying to cover our tracks as a world. The skepticism in the science behind the solution could face much of society's critique. As well, with the amount of money that this would take is astronomical. This band-aid solution, for only the temperature being affected, the amount of carbon is not being taken out of the atmosphere, so the temperature will rise once the shade is no longer of use. But the best thing that this giant parasol will do is give us time. Time to create more solutions, as it will lower the temperature so that the Earth is not continuing to rise in temperature, and we can tackle new issues.
Democrats and Republicans have grown further apart over the last decade in their assessments of the threat posed by climate change. I have here a researcher from Pew.
Nearly 8 in 10 Democrats, 78%, describe climate change as a major threat to the country's well-being, up from about 6 in 10, 58%, a decade ago. By contrast, 1 and 1/4 Republicans, 23%, consider climate change a major threat, a share that's almost identical to 10 years ago. Concern over climate change has also risen internationally, across 19 countries in 2022. People in many advanced economies express higher levels of concern than Americans. For instance, 81% of French adults and 73% of Germans describe climate change as a major threat.
You could stop that. There are multiple sides to the argument about the new Sun Shield prototype being launched within a few years. There are those who believe in climate change and advocate for the parasol, those that don't advocate for the solution, and those that argue that climate change in its all is a facade. Supporters of these who prioritize the development of strategies in reducing the climate crisis and argue the parasol is a viable solution believe that the parasol would stabilize the climate and therefore is a good idea and should be prioritized. Supporter to reducing the issue of climate change, Dr. Sapudi, said,
Look, I'm not saying this will be the solution, but I think everybody has to work towards every possible solution.
Some Republicans and Democrats who oppose this strategy and believe that climate change is a large issue argue the effectiveness versus the cost. Scientists are seeking between 10 to 20 million to build a similar model that would demonstrate the concept of the sun shield. They believe that the idea is extremely expensive and would not be recreated in time due to rapid warming and possible consequences. Therefore, they believe that in spending government money or on renewable energy or strategies to eliminate or remove carbon emissions from the atmosphere. Now, there are some Republicans who do not believe in climate change at all, and they believe that costs spent on climate change should be shifted to more important efforts like Social Security or American-made energy. Challenges that come from those who remain ignorant to the ongoing climate crisis slow down productivity with efforts to help climate change towards the parasol.
Here's some more information about the economics of this project. A prototype shade of 100 square feet is seeking between $10 million and $20 million to fund the demonstration, which means that were the actual project to be completed, it would be many times more expensive than $10 to $20 million. Especially since the most expensive part about this whole project would not be building the sunshade, it would be sending it into space. Falling costs of space launches and investments in space industrial economy have widened possibilities, some people say, but it is still very improbable that any one country would be able to afford this. Therefore, the world would have to come together to pay for this project. It currently costs at least $10,000 to launch a pound of payload into orbit. To be a viable option, the technology would need to be wafer light. So for this project to continue, the technology that we have surrounding material sciences and the weight of materials would need to advance more.
If this fails, there could be disastrous climate consequences for the world at large. If there are unintended consequences, the cost would be carried by the world. However, as we've seen historically, the places that contribute most to releasing greenhouse gases and therefore contribute most to global warming are often places that suffer the least effects, while places that contribute the fewest greenhouse gases and therefore contribute the least to global warming suffer the most effects.
Okay, so I'm sure you've heard about the giant parasol proposed solution. What do you know about it? I guess first.
So I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know that certainly one of the challenges would be figuring out the engineering to be able to put something that is big enough to actually have an impact on the amount of light that is getting through the atmosphere to make a difference. And so there's some significant engineering challenges.
Okay. Yes, I mean they've talked about how they'd only be able to send small prototypes into space. How do we normally put in efforts to space with such a small requirement or a big requirement?
Yeah. Well, if you think about the space station was constructed over multiple years, piece by piece. So I guess one way of approaching that engineering challenge would be to have sort of a modular approach, where very slowly, piece by piece, you're building up to create a larger and larger space a larger and larger area that's being walked. That would save resources in terms of you wouldn't need to use as much fuel to get something really large up there, but would require more resources because it would have to be more coordination since you're doing multiple launches in that case as opposed to just a single one. But that could be a way that scientists get around some of the other challenges of launching something that's really, really massive, right? Even the Webb telescope that JPL launched 2 years ago now was folded up before it was launched, and they had to do so much engineering to make sure that when it finally got to where it was supposed to be, that it would unfold properly in the right way. So if you're trying to do something similar with something that's large enough to make an impact, you're going to have to go through all of that process again. And I think Webb ended up being like $1 billion to develop, and it worked fine, which is good. But if you have sort of a more modular approach, especially now that we've got more of a streamlined process of using companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin to launch commercial flights, and they help do resupply missions and stuff to the ISS, that might be something that's a little bit easier to do and a little bit more economical.
In conclusion, the giant space parasol has its pros and cons. Based on the engineering challenges, the potential effects on the climate if it fails, the difficulty of creating societal consensus, the political discord, and the economic burden. But based on our research and the direness of the climate crisis, it is an option worth considering, exploring, and potentially investing money in. An outer space parasol will not solve the climate crisis, but it will give us time to work on reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that we are releasing into the atmosphere, as well as exploring options to remove the carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere. It may be the key to postponing and preventing a catastrophic, irreversible climate disaster. Thank you for listening.